Dark, terrifying, and nearly deadly. That is how the story begins on the Greenland ice in mid-July of 1942, when 8 sleek P-38 Lightnings and 2 hulking B-17 Flying Fortresses were swallowed by weather so brutal and by silence so complete that each pilot and crewman knew a single wrong choice could mean the end. Yet not one life was lost, and decades later one fighter would be found roughly 264 feet or about 80 meters under solid ice with the cockpit key still inside. A frozen secret that obsessed recoveries for years until an audacious team melted a narrow shaft through the glacier and raised the airplane piece by piece from a cavern carved by hot water, a feat unlike anything attempted in historic warbird recovery. The larger mystery took shape during Operation Bolero, the vast ferry effort sending American air power to Europe along the so-called snowball route from North America to the United Kingdom, staged through Goose Bay in Labrador, forward to Sondre Stromfjord on the west coast of Greenland, then across the Denmark Strait to Reykjavik in Iceland, and onward to Scotland, a chain of legs planned to keep multi-engine bombers and long-range fighters within range of fuel, weather reports, and rescue. But Greenland's cap hid danger that numbers alone could not tame. On Wednesday, July 15, 1942, 2 B-17s from an American bombardment squadron led 6 P-38s of the 94th Fighter Squadron of the 1st Fighter Group into the mid-Atlantic sky, the heavy bombers serving as shepherds for the single-seat twins with long-range and turbo-supercharged engines, the plan precise but also precarious given drifting storm systems, unreliable forward weather, and the inevitable uncertainty of early war ferry operations across ice, sea, and rock. About 90 minutes from Iceland, at roughly 12,000 feet or about 3,700 meters, cloud built like walls and cold sharpened dangerously to near minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit or about minus 23 degrees Celsius, and the snow thickened until the horizon vanished, forcing the formation to try different altitudes and headings in a search for a corridor through, while radio contact grew erratic and the threat of icing on wings and tail surfaces increased with every minute. With fuel reserves narrowing, the leaders reversed course toward Greenland, calculating that a return to Sondre Stromfjord, today Kongerlussuaq, offered the least bad option given the storm's spread, and the need to remain within reach of the Greenland Patrol and its cutters, which had been assigned months earlier to keep navigation aids alive, rescue airmen and sailors, and establish beacons and emergency strips along the coast for precisely such emergencies. The gamble still did not pay because the weather only thickened, and visibility remained shaved to near nothing, forcing the crews into a grim equation: press on toward fjord and rock with little fuel, or find open ice, land while power still turned the propellers, and survive on the cap until ground rescue could fight its way in. They chose ice, which looked flat but hid drifts, crust, and crevasses beneath, a terrifying surface that could forgive or punish based on a few knots of wind and a few degrees of pitch. The first P-38 tried a wheels-down landing and flipped, a stark lesson delivered in seconds that gear down in snow meant digging in rather than rolling. The remaining Lightnings and both B-17s went gear up and slid to a stop on their bellies, a choice that spared nose-over damage and lives, and when the engines wound down, the silence returned, broken only by the wind and by the voices of men suddenly very small on a sheet of blue-white. Miraculously, each pilot and crewman survived the landings, a number that mattered more than any airframe count that day. But survival in the following days required a different sort of flying skill, discipline, rationing, and fieldcraft, because the ice cap did not care that these machines were among the most advanced in the world, only that exposure and poor choices could kill quickly at temperatures well below freezing even in July. They waited 9 days, huddled in and around the crippled machines, using aircraft radios to raise help when ionospheric conditions allowed, pooling rations and improvising warmth and shelter from airframe parts and fabric, a kind of camp carved from metal and snow. Accounts preserved later recalled parachute harnesses and silk pressed into service as windbreaks and makeshift sled sails, a blend of ingenuity and grit that bought enough time for help to reach them onto the ice. Rescue came in stages as the United States Coast Guard cutter Northland, under the Greenland Patrol commanded by ice expert Edward Iceberg Smith, shifted from escort and beacon duty into aviation recovery, ferrying sled teams, coordinating over ice journeys, and bringing the stranded airmen off the cap, an early war example of how sea power, polar navigation, and aviation intertwined on that coast, with Northland rescuing 25 airmen from the 2 B-17s and 6 P-38s after the landings that July. By late 1942, The Greenland Patrol had also added radio direction finding and emergency landing sites on the coast, including work at Ikatek Fjord. But the Lost Squadron, as the icefield cluster would become known, remained where it lay, fastened to the cap by snowfall that would not simply dust the airframes, but would accumulate year after year, compress into new ice, and carry the machine seaward at roughly 100 feet or about 30 meters per year. For decades, the legend simmered, pristine fighters and big bombers just beneath the snow, awaiting recovery by anyone with cold weather grit and a crowbar. But Greenland is a conveyor, not a shelf. And by the 1980s, the first serious searchers learned the hard truth that these airplanes were not just snowed over, they were entombed and drifting, their last coordinates now meaningless, their new positions displaced miles down, glacier and sealed under many stories of compacted ice. Beginning in 1983, expedition after expedition probed the cap, sometimes drilling, sometimes surveying, often guessing, and always contending with weather, mechanics, funding, and the sheer scale of ice. 12 attempts came and went until the 13th expedition began, with a more disciplined plan, led by project manager Bob Cardin, backed by donors and veterans, and anchored by a willingness to marry engineering to persistence rather than rely on luck. The breakthrough came through the marriage of a steam probe to geometry and patience. The team used an 8-foot steel rod fed by hundreds of feet of reinforced hose to melt down and detect the airplane by fuel and oil traces, then sleeved the hole with approximately 264 feet or roughly 80 meters of 1-inch steel pipe, creating a guide for a new device lowered from an I-beam truss on the surface, a cone-shaped heater designed to melt a 4-foot or about 1.2-meter shaft straight to the target. They called that heater the Super Gopher, and it descended at roughly 2 to 4 feet per hour, or about half a meter per hour, while a bilge pump evacuated meltwater upward, a technique that turned ice into a manageable if relentless medium. Progress slowed when equipment failed, and on the coldest days the flow chilled, but the shaft inched downward until a telltale sheen of oil in the water announced that metal was near and that one of the lightnings had finally been reached. The aircraft they had chosen to pursue belonged to Lieutenant Harry Smith, identified years earlier in landing photos as having suffered the least visible damage, a data-driven choice that improved odds for a successful recovery within the short Arctic field season. When divers and technicians finally descended into the shaft and entered the buried space, they saw the lightning encased and compressed, the cockpit dented, yet still intact enough to tell a story. What they saw next became the emblem of the entire saga. Keys to the canopy were still inside the cockpit, a small object unchanged by time, evidence of the suddenness of the forced landing and the orderly evacuation, and a tangible link to the pilot who had left this machine on the ice 50 years earlier. The find turned a technical recovery into a human story, one that rippled outward into museums, air shows, and veterans' reunions. To liberate the Lightning required not just a shaft, but underground room, and the crew employed a hot water cannon to carve a cavern about 50 feet wide, or roughly 15 meters around the airframe, a dome that let them work, unbolt, and cut assemblies without crushing either the machine or the workers. It was slow work in wet cold, and the team had to sink 5 separate shafts to get enough lift area to bring up the last major piece. The center section spanning about 17 feet or roughly 5 meters and weighing on the order of 3 tons or about 2,700 kilograms. On August 1st, 1992, after nearly 3 months of field effort, the final large component rose to the surface, marking the end of one phase and the start of another. Restoration, a different kind of patience that would unfold far from Greenland, in a climate where the work could go year-round and where tradecraft in metal, systems, and historic research could be brought together with adequate funding and expert hands. The recovered Lightning journeyed to Middlesboro, Kentucky, where a shop began the long, meticulous task of bringing crushed and ice-stressed aluminum back into flying shape. Estimates later put the cost near $4 million and the retained original content near 80%. Numbers that reflect countless decisions to repair, reform, or replace parts to meet both authenticity and airworthiness, with rare components sourced worldwide and through museum trades. A decade after the recovery, in October 2002, the fighter flew again, now christened Glacier Girl, a P-38 whose serial number and lineage were beyond dispute, and whose rebirth brought the sound of twin Allison engines back to life, the same basic power plants that once took American fighters over long, cold stretches of ocean, along the ferry routes that made Allied air power possible in the European theater. In June 2007, an attempt to complete the original transatlantic journey from Teterboro, New Jersey to Duxford in England ended prematurely at Goose Bay in Labrador, when a coolant leak on the right engine forced a stop, underscoring that even a perfectly restored warbird is still a living machine that demands constant attention and respect, especially on long, over-water legs where range and redundancy are tested by weather and time. The recovery also reframed the broader historical picture of the lost squadron. The airplanes were not just waiting under a dusting. They were buried approximately 268 feet or about 82 meters below the surface, carried about 2 miles or roughly 3 kilometers from the original landing zone by annual snowfall and glacial flow, a correction that forced searchers to adopt new tools from ground-penetrating radar to detailed drift modeling. By the late 1990s and into the 2010s, improved ground-penetrating radar, eventually even mounted on small unmanned aircraft, gave teams a way to discriminate metal shapes under compacted layers, and new surveys indicated strong targets consistent with additional P-38s and possibly a B-17 in the vicinity, including evidence pointing to Lieutenant Robert Wilson's Lightning, often referenced as Echo in squadron accounts, igniting hopes for future recoveries that would be executed with greater precision and less risk than the first. The Coast Guard's Greenland patrol history provides essential context for why none of the men were lost during the 1942 incident. In that same year, the cutter Northland was rearmed with 2 3-inch deck guns, 4 20mm cannons, depth charge racks, radar, and sonar, and was tasked to clear ice from the roughly 90-mile or about 145-kilometer Sondrestrom Fjord, establish a radio beacon at its entrance, and operate as an aviation rescue platform, just as aircraft began crossing Greenland in June, putting the right ship in the right place when the lost squadron needed support in July. Those details matter because they dispel the romantic myth that pure luck saved the airmen. Instead, layered preparation, from beacons to patrol plans to sled teams coordinated off a capable flagship, created a web that rescued 25 airmen from the ice cap that month, and then continued to bring stranded crews out in later missions that same year, including risky flight by Northland's amphibian aircraft, which in November 1942 even cost Coast Guard lives during one rescue attempt. On the technical side, the Lightning itself remains a subject of equal fascination. A twin-engine, twin-boom fighter built by Lockheed with turbo superchargers for high-altitude performance, and a central weapons bay in the nose that concentrated fire. In spoken form, it is the P-38 Lightning, a structure whose strong central spar and tricycle gear made it a stable gun platform and a capable long-legged escort, the very qualities that made it suitable for ferry flights across cold oceans when paired with navigational shepherds like the B-17 Flying Fortress, read in narration as B-17 Flying Fortress. Yet even the most advanced fighter of its day could not outfly weather. Icing robs lift by roughening the airfoil and adding weight, cold saps, battery and oil viscosity, and cloud eliminates horizon cues, and when these evils arrive together at altitude, a pilot becomes a mathematician solving for drift, fuel burn, and endurance against an unknown wall of vapor, which is why the decision to land on ice, hard as it was, remained the rational choice once fuel margins shrank beyond safe glide to known terrain. The 2 B-17s brought their crews down safely as well, big bellies sliding on snow rather than buckling on wheels, and their presence in the formation reminds us that heavy bombers were the navigation backbone for early fighter ferry flights, their radios, astrodomes, and trained navigators providing a moving reference in an era before satellite positioning and precise inertial systems, an arrangement that carried thousands of airplanes to Europe, but still allowed for rare outliers like the Greenland landings when weather conspired to defeat every plan. When the 1992 team finally handled Glacier Girl's components in the open air, they had to solve practical problems in weight and height. The center section alone, 17 feet long or about 5 meters and weighing near 3 tons, required custom lifting, rigging, and a surface hoist that advanced only fractions of an inch with each set of cranks. A human-scale interface to a machine that had been put together with factory jigs, rivet guns, and production line precision 50 years earlier. From there, the Kentucky restoration shops took on tasks like straightening spars, replacing deeply creased skins, and rebuilding the cooling system and turbo plumbing to modern airworthy standards while preserving original geometry, a balancing act that is part art, part engineering, and part archival science, resulting in an airframe that could be flown in demonstrations, yet also stand as a documented artifact of a specific squadron, date, and event. In subsequent years, Glacier Girl changed hands and continued to fly in the United States, appearing at heritage flight demonstrations and drawing lines of viewers who had learned about the recovery from documentaries and museum exhibits, all of which traced their way back to that 4-foot diameter shaft, and to the moment the first daylight touched aluminum that had not seen sun since Franklin Roosevelt was president. Meanwhile, the searchers did not quit because the story is not over. Live Science reports in 2018 noted a new discovery of a World War II warplane deep under Greenland's ice that echoed the 1992 recovery, suggesting that evolving methods and drone-mounted sensors can now map buried shapes more reliably and plan retrievals that minimize risk, time, and cost, the necessary ingredients if additional fighters or a flying fortress are to be brought up in years ahead. No, the Coast Guard's archive frames the final lesson. Logistics and rescue infrastructure, set up months before the crisis, made survival possible. That same principle, applied to historic recovery, enabled success half a century later when a team arrived with proper tools, a clear plan, and enough margin to adapt when pumps failed or heaters stalled. Because the ice respects patience more than bravado, and engineering answers questions that myth cannot. As for the whispered detail that captured the imagination, the key in the cockpit, it is attested by multiple accounts from the recovery and from warbird histories that highlighted how little had shifted inside the Lightning, even as 268 feet or about 82 meters of snowfall layered above. A reminder that within the violence and movement of a glacier, there are pockets of stillness where human artifacts wait uncorrupted until someone returns to ask them what happened. When listeners today hear P-38 Lightning and B-17 Flying Fortress as spoken designations, the words carry more than performance figures. They carry a human story of 10 aircraft and their crews who wrestled with weather, made the hard choice to land, endured 9 days on the ice, and went home because preparation met determination, and because in July 1942, in a place where distances are counted in dozens of miles or tens of kilometers and temperatures can plunge in minutes, the right decisions arrived fast enough to save every life, a statistic that beats any speed or range figure on the page.